The twin moons of Yarth hung low on the horizon, fat and molten red, their glow painting the stone spires of Urcal Prime in shades of blood and fire. Wind howled through the canyons, carrying with it the dry rasp of sand and the iron scent of prey. Perched on a jagged cliffside, Kryn inhaled deeply through the slits of his helm, the filters translating the chaotic sense of the world into information. Oxygen content, stable. Radiation, negligible. Most importantly, human presence faint, but undeniable, his four eyes adjusted independently, scanning every crevice below. It was a barren, hostile world, the kind of place no sane species would colonize. And yet, humans had. Like fungus, Kryn muttered in his native tongue, the Cathari language a guttural cascade of clicks and snarls. They grow where nothing should live. He crouched lower, armored limbs blending with the jagged rock. His exosuit, scavenged from 100 dead foes and reforged to fit his frame, shifted color to mimic the rusted canyon walls. The human settlement was still hours away on foot, but Kryn had not come to strike yet. His orders were reconnaissance, map their defenses, observe their patrols, prepare for the slaughter to come. Yet as always, the hunt called to him. The Cathari were predators, not in metaphor, not in myth, but in design. Their species had been forged by eons of violence, rising to dominance on their home world by devouring anything that stood in their path, including their own. Cathari young were not nurtured or protected. They were abandoned to the wild within days of hatching, their only teacher the agony of survival. Those who lived became hunters. Those who died were forgotten. And Kryn had not merely survived, he had thrived. Commander of the First Talon, slayer of 6 worlds. The crimson crest etched into his helm marked him as bloodborne, one who had never once failed a hunt. His gaze swept the canyon floor again and froze. Movement. Small, unsteady, a lone figure stumbled among the rocks, a strange sight in this desolate stretch of wasteland. Through his magnifiers, Kryn focused and narrowed his eyes. A human, and a tiny one. It was barely a meter tall, wrapped in a bright yellow exosuit far too large for its body. Its gait was clumsy, its breathing ragged. It was moving away from the settlement's direction, lost, then, lost and alone. Va Kryn's mandibles curled into a grin. A cub, he hissed, strayed from the nest. Every instinct in him surged with primal hunger. A kill here would be swift and easy, a message to the human colony that Cathari eyes were already upon them. He imagined the fear in their faces when they found the broken body, the demoralization, the weakness. His claws flexed against the rock, but then the wind shifted and a new scent rode on it. Musky, metallic, acrid, predator. Kryn turned his head just in time to see it. A razorgnish. It was a canyon-born nightmare, 6 meters of muscle and scale, its jaws lined with crystalline teeth sharp enough to shear titanium. Its 6 limbs propelled it low and silent over the ground, its eyes locked on the tiny human. The cub was oblivious. It had paused to examine a pebble, perhaps thinking it was something valuable. Its innocence, or stupidity, would cost it its life within seconds. Va Kryn watched, fascinated. Nature's hierarchy was at work. Predator devours prey. Strong conquers weak. It was the way of all life, yet something shifted inside him. Something he could not name. The razorgnish coiled, ready to pounce. The cub still hadn't noticed. It would die before it could even scream. And then, without realizing he'd made a choice, Kryn moved. He launched from the ridge, cloak flaring like the wings of a dark god. The wind screamed past his helm as he dropped 30 meters, landing with a thunderous crack that split the canyon floor. The razorgnish twisted mid-lunge, startled, too late. Kryn's plasma spear flew from his hand in a streak of blue fire. It pierced the beast's eye socket, erupting from the back of its skull. The razorgnish convulsed, stumbled, and collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs and steaming blood. Silence returned to the canyon. The cub finally turned and froze at the sight of the towering Cathari warrior. For a heartbeat, its eyes went wide with terror. It stumbled backward, tripping over its own feet. "Stay," Kryn growled, unsure if the creature could understand. He approached slowly, claws raised not in threat, but caution. The cub's lips trembled. Its breaths came in quick, shallow bursts. Then, to Kryn's utter shock, it ran toward him, and wrapped its tiny arms around his armored leg. The gesture was alien. Cathari did not touch except to kill. They did not cling, did not seek comfort. And yet here was this fragile, soft-skinned creature pressing its face against his armor. Sobbing into the steel, it thought he was salvation. Va Kren stared down at it, unsure what to do. The cub's heartbeat was rapid but steady. It was alive, because of him. Foolish creature, he muttered, though his voice lacked venom. I am not your kin. The cub only clung tighter. Above, clouds began to gather. The first hints of a sandstorm swirled along the canyon edges. Kren knew he could leave now, slip back into the shadows and complete his mission. But as he looked down at the small, trembling figure, something deep within his chest stirred. Something ancient and unfamiliar. If you leave it, it will die. The thought struck like a spear through his mind, growling softly. Kren knelt and lifted the cub into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of warmth and heartbeat. The child's helmeted head rested against his chest, its breathing slowing as exhaustion claimed it. Kren rose and turned toward the distant glimmer of the human settlement. For the first time in his life, he was carrying prey not to devour it, but to return it. Somewhere beneath the howling wind, a voice in the back of his mind whispered a question he could not ignore. The storm came faster than expected. By the time Kren was halfway across the barren plain, the sky had darkened into a roiling bruise of dust and lightning. Wind screamed over the cracked earth, tearing at his cloak and stinging his exposed plating with needle-fine grains of red sand. The human cub whimpered and stirred in his arms, pressing its helmeted face deeper into his chest as if instinctively seeking shelter. He shifted his hold, shielding the tiny form from the worst of the storm's fury with his armored body. This is folly, he muttered aloud, though he knew no one could hear him but the child. I should have left you to the canyon beasts. This is not our way. And yet he did not turn back. The settlement, a cluster of metal domes and angular towers, loomed faintly on the horizon, barely visible through the swirling storm. It looked pitiful compared to the towering fortresses of the Cathari, but it was stubbornly alive, defying the unforgiving planet that sought to erase it. It was, Kren grudgingly admitted, impressive in its own strange way. He adjusted his optics, magnifying the view. Tall, skeletal towers bristled with scanning dishes and gun emplacements. Floodlights swept across the plain like the gaze of some enormous creature. Thick blast walls ringed the perimeter, and watchtowers crowned the corners, each manned by 2 or 3 human sentries in dull gray exo-armor. They were expecting predators. They just weren't expecting one carrying a child. The first searchlight locked onto him when he was still half a kilometer away. Almost instantly, others followed, converging on his towering figure with harsh, blinding beams. Contact! A distant voice barked through a loudspeaker, distorted by the storm. All units, armed and ready. Target approaching perimeter, unknown classification. Within seconds, gun emplacements swiveled toward him. Drones rose from their docking ports, weapons primed. On the walls, soldiers appeared like ghosts in the haze, their rifles trained unerringly on his chest. Va Kren slowed his pace, but did not stop. His every instinct screamed at him to run, to strike, to disappear before they unleashed their firepower. But the cub stirred in his arms, and something within him refused to abandon the task now. He raised his free hand slowly, a universal gesture even across species, and shouted over the storm, I come without weapon. He roared, his deep voice amplified by the suit's external speakers. I bring one of your spawn. The words were clumsy. Spawn was the closest Cathari translation for child, but they seemed to have the intended effect. There was a pause. The hum of charging weapons softened slightly. Then a female voice, calm but tense, boomed from the walls. Stop where you are and place the child on the ground. Kren's mandibles twitched. The storm will consume it if I do, he growled. I will approach, slowly, no closer. The voice snapped. I repeat, stop. He stopped. The storm howled around him, sand battering his armor like hail. His stance remained unthreatening, his weapon still holstered on his back. The cub stirred again and whimpered weakly. A few moments later, the gates shuddered and began to open, not fully, but just enough for a squad of humans to step out. They advanced cautiously, weapons raised, armor glinting in the red light of the moons. Their leader, a tall man with a scar across his jaw and a rank insignia on his shoulder, stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Vkrn's head. "On your knees," the commander ordered. Slowly, Vkrn considered refusing. Cathari warriors did not kneel to pray, but one glance at the fragile weight in his arms silenced that pride. He lowered himself to one knee, the earth cracking beneath the weight of his armored form. The humans approached warily. Two of them reached out and lifted the cub from his arms. The child, dazed and exhausted, stirred weakly, and then, to Vkrn's astonishment, reached back toward him, small fingers grasping at the air. "Eli!" A cry rang out from beyond the gates. A woman broke through the cordon of soldiers, her face pale beneath a helmet hastily thrown on. She stumbled through the sand and dropped to her knees as the soldiers handed the child into her arms. "Oh God, Eli, I thought I'd lost you. I thought," her words dissolved into sobs as she clutched the cub, Eli, tightly against her. The child buried its face in her neck, murmuring something too soft for Vkrn to hear. The sight froze him. Cathari mothers did not weep for their young. They did not embrace, did not mourn, did not protect. A hatchling's fate was its own, strength or death, nothing in between. And yet here was this human woman, trembling with relief, holding her offspring as if the universe itself revolved around that single tiny heartbeat. Why would any species waste such energy on the weak? The commander approached him again, rifle still raised. His expression was unreadable. "You saved him," the man said. It was not a question. Vkrn's voice was low. "The canyon beast would have fed on it, and you killed it." "Yes." The commander studied him for a long moment. "Why?" he asked, echoing Vkrn's own thoughts. "You're Cathari. I've read the reports. Your kind doesn't spare anything. Not even your own." Vkrn's mandibles clicked softly. "Perhaps I grew curious." A faint, humorless smile touched the man's lips. "Curious, huh? Well, your curiosity saved my niece's life." He gestured to the woman and the child. "Her name's Mara, the boy's Eli. They mean everything to each other." Vkrn turned his gaze to the pair again. Mara was speaking softly to the cub, who clung to her with desperate strength. The boy's small hands twisted in the fabric of her suit, as though afraid that if he let go, she would vanish. "Mean everything," Vkrn repeated quietly. "Strange words. It's how we survive," the commander said. "We protect each other, especially the little ones, because one day they'll protect us." The Cathari warrior said nothing. The concept gnawed at the edges of his understanding. In his culture, the weak were called to strengthen the species. But these humans, they guarded their weak. They built walls, risked their lives, waged wars, all for the sake of their young. It was not logical. And yet, perhaps that was why they endured. The commander's radio crackled. "Sir, command wants the prisoner secured, right?" he said, then turned back to Vkrn. "You saved a life today. That means you're not dying on this spot, but you're still an enemy combatant. We're taking you into custody, prisoner." Vkrn's blood burned at the word. It was an insult, a Cathari warrior chained like a beast. But again, his eyes drifted to the child, still nestled safely in its mother's arms. Against all reason, the anger cooled. He inclined his head slowly. "Do what you must." A dozen rifles tracked his every movement as they fitted restraints around his arms. Not that they could truly hold him if he chose otherwise. As they led him toward the gates, the storm's fury began to ease, revealing the full sprawl of the settlement. It was small, fragile, vulnerable, and yet full of life. Just before they pushed him through the gates, a small voice called out behind him, "Big friend." Ellie's voice was faint, but unmistakable, cutting through the hiss of the wind. Vkrn paused. Slowly, he turned his head. The child was peering at him from his mother's embrace, one small hand raised in a wave. The Cathari warrior inclined his head once, almost imperceptibly, before the soldiers shoved him forward into the human city, into captivity, and into a world he would soon learn was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The cell was too small for a Cathari warrior. It was a simple chamber of reinforced alloy, barely tall enough for Vkrn to stand upright. Pale light glowed from the ceiling, cold and sterile, casting his crimson armor in dull, lifeless shades. Chains of composite carbon, designed to restrain heavy machinery, bound his wrists and ankles to the floor. The humans had done their homework. 3 days had passed since his capture. 3 days of interrogation, analysis, and silence. They had asked questions, of course. Endless questions. How many Cathari were on Urcal Prime? What were their plans? Where was the fleet? Vkrin answered none of them. He simply watched, and there was much to watch through the narrow viewport above his cell door. He saw the rhythm of human life unfold. Soldiers patrolling in pairs, their boots ringing against steel decking. Engineers hauling crates and tools. Scientists in white coats arguing over data readouts. Everywhere he looked, there was activity, purposeful, coordinated, and deeply alien. The Cathari thrived on hierarchy and strength. Each warrior stood alone, competing for dominance, clawing upward through violence and cunning. Cooperation existed only when it served the hunt. And yet here was a species whose every breath seemed dedicated to cooperation. Building, repairing, sustaining, protecting. Even the smallest tasks were shared. Even the weakest were given roles. And most astonishing of all, they trusted one another. It unsettled him. On the 4th day, they brought him food again. The guard, a young soldier barely into adulthood, approached with a tray of protein blocks and nutrient paste. The Cathari diet was famously broad. They could digest nearly anything. Still, Vkrin stared at the offering with disdain. "You expecting me to eat the slop?" he rumbled. The soldier swallowed nervously. "It's what we've got that's, safe for your biology." "Safe," Vakrin repeated with a low laugh. "Do you fear I will choke myself to death before your interrogators get their answers?" The soldier shifted uneasily. "Orders are to keep you alive. That's all I know." Vkrin tilted his head, studying the boy. "You do not hate me," he said, more observation than question. The soldier blinked. "Should I? I am your enemy. Your people will die under Cathari blades." The boy's expression hardened. "Maybe, but you saved Eli. That matters." The name again, Eli, the cub. The reason he was here at all. Vkrin said nothing as the boy placed the tray on the floor and backed away. When the door sealed again, the warrior stared at the food for a long time before finally lifting a protein block and taking a bite. It tasted like dust, but it was sustenance, and sustenance meant survival. Later that cycle, the door opened once more. This time, it was not a soldier who entered. The woman, Mara, stepped inside, a datapad tucked under her arm and a thin smile on her lips. Without her helmet, her features were softer than he remembered. Tired eyes, lines of worry etched deep, a scar across her temple, old but still visible. "She was a soldier too, once. You look worse than when we dragged you in," she said lightly. "I have been in worse cages," Vkrin replied. "I don't doubt it." She moved closer, staying a careful distance away. "Do you know why I'm here?" "Interrogation." "Not today." She held up the datapad and tapped it. A series of images appeared, photographs, Vkrin assumed. Humans laughing around a table. A group of children playing in a dusty courtyard. Soldiers gathered around a holomap, planning something. "Life, frozen in frames. These are our people," Mara said. "The colony's families. Scientists, farmers, engineers, kids. You think we're soldiers, but we're not. We're settlers, explorers trying to carve out a future. Your kind carves futures from the bones of others," Vkrin growled. "That is why the Cathari hunt you." She ignored the barb. "Maybe, but look at them." She pointed to one of the images, a group of children, their arms around one another as they grinned at the camera. "What do you see?" "Small, weak, easy prey. And yet," she said softly, "they are the reason we build walls. They are why we fight. Because without them, there is no future worth fighting for." Vkrin frowned. "You place your survival in the hands of those who cannot even protect themselves." "No," she shook her head. "We protect them until they can." The simplicity of the idea was almost insulting, and yet, something about it struck him. He remembered his hatch brood, hundreds of tiny Cathari larvae scattering into the feral wastes. Fewer than a dozen had survived to adulthood. The rest had been devoured, by predators, by rivals, by him. What if someone had protected them? What if they had protected each other? The thought was dangerous, heretical, and yet it clung to him like a burr. Mara watched his face closely. You don't understand us yet. But Eli talks about you every day. He thinks you're a hero. I am no hero, Vkrin growled. I am death in flesh. Funny, she said, standing to leave. Heroes and monsters often look the same to a child. The next several days passed in a blur of routine. Food, observation, interrogation. But Vkrin's mind was no longer still. He began to study the humans more carefully. Their infrastructure, their rituals, the way they organized their days, tended their young, honored their dead. He watched soldiers drill not as rivals, but as a unit, their trust in one another absolute. He watched families gather for meals, laughter filling the corridors like music. He watched strangers stop to help one another with burdens, even when they gained nothing from it. The Cathari had strength. They had discipline. But they did not have this. It was during one of these long hours of observation that Eli returned. The child appeared at the door one afternoon, flanked by 2 nervous guards and carrying something clutched in his small hands. When the door opened, Eli marched in with all the solemnity of a soldier and held up a crudely drawn picture. It was a sketch, clumsy and lopsided, drawn in bright colors. It showed a towering 4-eyed figure, him, unmistakably standing beside a small stick-figure child. Above them, a bright yellow sun smiled down. The words scrawled beneath it were uneven but clear. Thank you, big friend. Vkrin stared at the paper as though it were a weapon aimed at his chest. For you. Eli said shyly. Mama says it's good to say thank you. The warrior took the picture with careful claws, holding it as though it might shatter. This is an offering. It's a gift, the boy explained. Because you helped me. That's what friends do. Friends, Vkrin repeated, tasting the word. Cathari do not have such a thing. Eli tilted his head. Then maybe you should. The child's smile was disarming, small, pure, and impossibly bright. And as the guards led him away, Vkrin felt something he had not felt since his hatchling days. Before the blood and the hunts and the endless killing. Warmth. That night, Vkrin could not sleep. He sat in the corner of his cell, the drawing clutched tightly in his clawed hands, and stared at the words until they blurred. Thank you, big friend. He had slaughtered thousands in his life. He had brought ruin to worlds. No one had ever thanked him. No one had ever called him friend. It was then, in that silence, in that tiny cell far from home, that Vkrin understood something fundamental. Strength was not measured by how many enemies you could kill. It was measured by how many lives you could protect. And for the first time in his long, brutal existence, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. The first sign of the Cathari fleet's arrival was the sky turning black. It started as a ripple in the upper atmosphere, a distortion, a flicker, and then the clouds split apart as colossal warships emerged from orbit, their hulls like serrated daggers against the pale light of the twin moons. Their engines screamed as they descended, blotting out the stars. The humans saw it too. Sirens wailed across the colony. Soldiers rushed to their stations. Civilians were herded into underground shelters, their faces pale with terror. For Vkrin, chained in his cell, the sound was like an echo of his past, the familiar cry of the hunt. His people were here, and they had come to kill. The cell door burst open with a hiss of pressurized air. Commander Holt, the scarred officer who had captured him, stepped inside, his helmet tucked under his arm. His expression was grim. They're Cathari, Holt said. No doubt about it. Dropships already on approach. They're going to hit us in less than 2 hours. Vkrin rose slowly from his crouch. The chains rattled as he moved. You do not have the strength to repel them. I know, Holt replied. That's why I'm here. He tossed a small device onto the floor. The magnetic locks on Vkrin's restraints disengaged with a sharp click. You're free. Vkrin stared down at his hands, then back up at the human. You would release your enemy on the eve of battle? You saved one of ours, Holt said, and you haven't betrayed us yet. If there's even a chance you can help, I'll take it. And if I choose to join them, then at least we die knowing we tried. There was no threat in Holt's voice, just weary honesty. It was a tone Vkrin had never heard from a rival, much less an enemy. He flexed his claws, the weight of choice pressing down on him like never before. The Cathari fleet's flagship descended through the clouds, a black spear of metal and fury. Vkrin knew it well, the Verkal, command vessel of Lord Scarix, supreme talon of the Cathari, and his direct superior. He knew what Scarix would do. He would bombard the colony from orbit, reducing it to slag. Then the ground forces would sweep in, slaughtering the survivors. The humans would be erased, just another infestation purged. And Vkrin would be hailed as the scout who made it possible. This is what I was bred for, he told himself as he stalked through the corridors of the human base. This is the destiny of our kind. But the words felt hollow. He found Mara near the civilian shelter entrance, helping terrified children into armored transport pods. Eli clung to her leg, wide-eyed but brave. Big friend. The boy shouted when he saw him. He broke free and ran to Vkrin, who knelt instinctively to catch him. I knew you'd come, Eli said, hugging his armored chest. I do not know why, Vkrin murmured, more to himself than to the child. Because we're friends, Eli said simply. It was absurd. It was illogical. It was true. The first bombardment hit just outside the colony walls. The ground shook, throwing people off their feet. Dust rained from the ceilings. Screams echoed through the shelter corridors. They're softening us up for the ground troops. Holt shouted over the chaos. We have maybe 30 minutes before they breach the perimeter. Then we fight, Mara said, loading her rifle. We fight for every inch. Vkrin stood silently as alarms blared and soldiers scrambled to defensive positions. He looked at the terrified faces, at the children clutching their parents, at the old and wounded who could not flee, and something inside him broke. All his life, he had been taught that strength was measured by how many you could kill. But here, in this moment, he understood a greater truth. Strength was measured by how many you could protect. He turned to Holt. Take me to your command center. The command deck buzzed with frantic energy. Tactical maps glowed on every screen. Red icons, Cathari drop pods, dotted the skies above the colony. Each was a spear tip carrying a death squad. Vkrin approached the central console and activated his wrist interface. Ancient glyphs flickered to life. Cathari fleet codes, encrypted channels, targeting signals. What are you doing? Holt demanded, ending this before it begins. Vkrin said. He found the uplink beacon buried deep within the colony's communication net. The device the Cathari would use to lock onto their targets from orbit. Without it, their bombardment would be blind, scattered, far less effective. With a single command, he overloaded the beacon's core. A pulse of energy surged through the network, frying circuits and burning out targeting systems across the planet. On the flagship Verkal, Scarix would be watching his targeting data vanish into static. The bombardment faltered. Holt stared at him. You just betrayed my people, Vkrin finished. Yes, the room fell silent. Minutes later, the first Cathari drop pods slammed into the ground outside the colony walls. Doors exploded outward, disgorging warriors in black and crimson armor. Plasma spears crackling in their hands. Vkrin strode to the armory. The soldiers stepped aside without a word as he selected his weapons. A long plasma halberd, a kinetic shield, and a set of reinforced combat plates he had once worn to lead extermination campaigns. But today, they would serve a different purpose. The colony's outer gates groaned as the Cathari assault began. Mirages of plasma bolts lit the night sky. Human soldiers fired from behind barricades, their rifles spitting beams of searing light. The air smelled of ozone, blood, and burning metal. Vkrin stepped into the storm. He met his kin in the killing fields beyond the walls. Blades clashed, plasma hissed. The Cathari warriors roared battle cries in their guttural tongue. Cries he had once shouted himself, Vkrin. One of them snarled, his mandibles flaring in disbelief. You fight beside prey? I fight for life, Vkrin growled, impaling him with a thrust that burned through armor and bone. Another lunged. Vkrin parried, his halberd singing with heat. Around him, human soldiers rallied, emboldened by the sight of the towering alien fighting at their side. Together, they drove the invaders back, step by bloody step. The battle raged for hours. The ground ran slick with blood, Cathari and human alike. The colony walls were scorched and battered, but they held. And at the center of it all, Vkrin fought with a ferocity even his kin had never seen. When the last drop pod exploded, and the surviving invaders fled into the night, the battlefield fell silent. The humans had won. At dawn, The survivors gathered outside the battered gates. The air smelled of smoke and victory. Children emerged from shelters, blinking at the morning light. Families embraced. Soldiers wept for their fallen and cheered for the living. And then they saw Vkrin. He stood alone amid the wreckage, his armor scarred and smoking, his halberd planted firmly in the ground. The humans parted around him, fear and awe mixing in their eyes. Mara approached first, her helmet tucked under her arm. "You saved us," she said. "I did what was right," Vkrin replied quietly. Eli broke free from the crowd and ran to him, throwing his small arms round the warrior's leg. "Told you," he said breathlessly. "Big friend." Vkrin looked down at the boy, the one who had begun it all, and a rare, unfamiliar warmth filled his chest. He reached down and gently placed one massive clawed hand on Ellie's head. "Big friend," he echoed. He turned his gaze to the horizon. The Cathari would not forget this betrayal. They would come for him. Perhaps they would come for this colony again. But if they did, they would not find prey. They would find guardians. Epilogue strength redefined weeks later. Long after the wreckage had been cleared and the colony rebuilt, Vkrin walked the streets freely. Children waved to him. Soldiers saluted. Scientists approached him with questions. He was still alien, still different, but no longer an enemy. For the first time in his life, Vkrin felt something deeper than the thrill of the hunt, something more enduring than victory. He felt belonging. He had been born to be a predator, but here, among the humans, he had learned a greater purpose, not to hunt, not to conquer, but to protect. And that, he realized, was the strongest thing he had ever done.